Welcome to the Journal of Biophilic Design podcast. Many thanks for joining us on the Journal of Biophilic Design today. We're really excited to be joined by David Kirkland. He's architect, designer, founder of the practice, Kirkland Fraser Moor. There's going to put a link on the journal of biophilicdesign.com. So I encourage everybody to subscribe, go on the website and have a look. There'll also be images of some of David's works and links as well. David is also a photographer and he's founder of D-Lab, which is the design lab, which has a summer school and a training programs. For instance, he did a recent architecture challenge with sort of budding architects, aspiring architects, to design a space on Mars, learning how to live on the edge of the possible, and also help inspire how we can design our world, really, I suppose, here on Earth for the benefit of people, places and planets. His practice covers sustainability, biomimicry and biophilic design, and which obviously infuses his home methodology and practice. And I'm actually going to stop there because I'm going to introduce David so he can tell us about what he does. But David, many thanks for joining us, first of all.
You're welcome, Vanessa. Nice to be here.
Lovely. Obviously, I've introduced you as an architect and also as a photographer, but your photography, again, I'm going to put a link on the journal of biophilicdesign.com, but I would say your photography, you have a poet's eye. It's incredibly beautiful, and there's also that infuses your own architectural practice. It's very distinctive, it's very beautiful, very elegant, lots of light, and it's very distinctive. Can you tell us a little bit about what got you into architecture in the first place, please?
Well, I suppose it has to go back to childhood. So I was born and brought up in a fairly remote part of Zimbabwe many years ago. It was, it was quite I'd like to say, it's sort of a feral upbringing, where there were very little boundaries, and with that kind of climate, you don't have to wear much, and you can go around barefoot, and so it was fairly wild. We were always getting worms, I think, through our feet and things, just because we wouldn't listen to grown-ups. But I guess part of play was, given that there wasn't really much there, but you had this wilderness, so it was I guess it was a bit like Eden, really, and you could rummage around in perfect freedom. And I guess what we used to do a lot, or I used to do a lot, was just making things with whatever's there. So sticks, mud, we might have a few toys or whatever, but we'd build cities out of mud and rocks, dams, forts. So I guess there was always a sort of element of, it's not just about making a habitat or a little fort. Actually, what happens if there's a few of you? You've got a bit of a street going, and you can sort of, well, you've got your cars there on the mud, and you're making a dam, and then maybe there's a school, and so master planning kind of creeps in, and it's just this systemic view of creating from essentially dirt and twigs and things, and coming back many years later to think that that's what we do, is basically take dirt and we turn it into things, but we must always remember that the dirt must return back to being dirt, and we should leave it having done a positive thing in the world in its interim. So so ever since then, I guess everyone kind of said, oh, he's going to be an architect. So I guess I just followed it. A brief rebellious period when I was a teenager, I think, like, well, who wants to do that? And then of course it all pans out. So yeah, it's definitely, I guess it's in my bones. But I don't think, you've mentioned that I do these other things as well. Unfortunately, the way corporations are run, everything has to be subdivided. But in my head, I don't really, it's not subdivided. It's just one thing, really.
Yeah. Do you find your photography informs your practice? Because I know you do a lot of beautiful landscapes and beautiful observational photography of nature. Do you find that informs your practice?
Yeah, very much so. To be honest, the rebellious period was when I didn't quite get into my grades with the UCAS. I didn't quite get into uni, so I thought, right, I'm off. I'm going to go and work for the local photographer. And fortunately, my dad said, no, you're not. You're off to find a place for you. So yeah, I guess the photography in my teenage years, I sort of dabbled in that a little bit. And I guess it's about light. It's just about light, expressing about light, and what does that mean to human beings, and what are the stories we can tell with that. And architecture is the same sort of thing. So space is basically defining things with light. And I think, I can't remember who mentioned it, but someone had a quote that architecture was frozen music. So music and photography and art and sculpture and architecture and just manufacturing, it's all part of, to me, it's all part of the same thing. So the photography does help me. And I guess I have to say, I do, a lot of people, when I show my photographs, they go, I don't know what that is. Why? It's very, what is that? And I think it's a very architecturally, it's an architectural type of eye, which isn't necessarily what good photography is about, because it's sort of can be quite formal. But that's just what we do, and it works the other way around. So the photography influences the architecture as well. So it's fine. It's good.
Yeah, I think, I mean, you mentioned there about all, it's about the light.
Yeah.
Same for me. I'm a photographer too, which is kind of maybe why I see something quite different. I suppose, I'm reflecting on it in a different way to maybe some other observers. I think it incredibly beautiful, and it resonates with me. But I think you just mentioned light, and I think, as I mentioned to you, really, I think if I saw your work anywhere, I would recognize it. It's it's like there's this sort of, it's not a paring back. There's as I said, in the words I can only think of is beauty and elegance. I mean, some of it I thought was quite brutalist. Some of your sort of expressionist, sort of conceptual stuff as well. And I said, if I think I saw it out of context, I kind of would feel it. But there's a lot of things about there's a lot of creations that have light that sort of seem to, for me, that focus on bringing as much natural light in. And I know, and maybe we could just talk a little bit about that from a sort of biophilic point of view. Obviously, biophilia being one of the main things of bringing natural light in, but also why why sustainability, for instance, is really important to you.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've always felt naturally, obviously, having been brought up in Africa in the wilderness, that it's just life. I think, when we use the terms sustainability, biophilia, biomimicry, all these sorts of things, basically, they're just describing the foundational thing about what life is, life with a capital L. And just to step back into your comments about the photography and the architecture, brutalist, I'm quite interested and passionate about narratives, particularly archetypal, very primitive narratives, which kind of get down to, I guess, being an architect, you want to get down to the foundations of things and then build up. So stripping things back down to what is the foundation of something, and what are the questions that are asked, and what are the stories that are coming from that are just elemental to being human. But obviously elemental to being human is life. And so how do you make life sort of flourish and abundant? And I love the story of the Eden creation story, where there's this sort of, I mean, I don't think it was ever said that it was perfect, but it's sort of, it's good and it works, and there's sort of right relationships. And then the sort of instruction is to go and extend that into the boundaries of, I guess, who knows what, but things that are not like that. So if you're going to have flourishing for human life, because it's systemic, you have to know how life is sustained, and you better not trample on that or muddy those waters, because you're gonna struggle. And so how do you make that so that humans can thrive, all humans can thrive to the fullness of their lives, but at the same time the rest of the creation? And how do you do that in balance? So I guess, to me, that's sustainability. And biophilia is basically asking the question, I suppose, given our man-made world, how we've eliminated so much of the natural world, how do we get it back in? And I think the key thing for us is to not view ourselves as separate from nature. There's always this thing about the natural versus the man-made. But actually, the man-made is just a subset of the natural, because you can't escape the boundaries of nature, of the universe. And to recognize that, and then to sort of realize that you have to work within the grain of that. Otherwise, you can work against the grain of that, but that's not going to promote life. That's not going to make life abundant. So, how do we understand that more, and how do we bring that in? So it's, in our cities, lots of concrete, lots of built up areas, lots of hard things. We just need to learn, find a new way of bringing these things in. But it's not just about the things you can see, or the things that we would term naturally life, like plants or air. we should also be aware of things like chemicals. I think the word that we use nowadays is the Anthropocene, which is, it's the age that we're in for humans, but I question that, and I think we should really call it the chemocene, because the thing that is making everything different is our manipulation at the chemical level of things, and how that gets into the environment, every environment, including our bodies, you know, plastics, all these sorts of things, volatile organic compounds, all those sorts of things. You know, if you're going to make a space and people are going to live in it, like we're talking earlier about hospitals and things like that, you know, we can bring in light, but how do we make the space inside a healthy space that promotes life? So whether it's to do with healing or just ordinary things like schools or offices or homes. I think there's a statistic that says the inside of our houses are on average 6 times more polluted than the outside, just with the stuff that we bring in, and we don't realize we're bringing this stuff in on a chemical level.
Yeah, it's true, isn't it? You think people don't think about it. I mean, nearly everything is wrapped in plastic for a start. You know, your vegetables are wrapped in plastic. I mean, you know, they do leak into your vegetables and things. And I mean, for years I haven't done that. You know, I just try and stay away from everything that's wrapped in plastic as much as you can. But you know, it's pretty difficult as a consumer to actually do that. But and even more so if you're trying to design something, because you've got to think about budgets. And you know, if you're working for a client, you know, they've got a bottom line, they've got an idea, and you're saying, well, actually I want to put in, you know, this natural wood and I want to do that, and it's sustainable, and then there's a price attached to that. So I suppose until, you know, the price tags come down maybe slightly, then it will make it more accessible to people. Or maybe if just the options aren't there, maybe there's also the recycling aspect as well, isn't there? You know, things that have off-gassed and things.
That's right. I mean, I think it's a long journey. We're all impatient, and we must move faster because it's too slow. And I think the crash in 2008 put us back 10 years on some of these things. But I think we have to remain optimistic, and we have to, you know, think that we're, you know, it's moving in the right direction. You could sort of say, for example, like coal. When we had coal in the Industrial Revolution, you know, no one would ever think of doing that now, and you know, it's just taboo. But actually, at that time, it was the thing that helped lift, you know, a large proportion of humanity out of abject poverty and things like that. So it has, sometimes there is a place and time for these things, but then we have to, as humans, recognize when the time and place is finished, and you know, really, we shouldn't be doing that anymore. We should be moving on. And I think that time has come with a lot of the things that we're doing at the moment, and you know, hopefully we're waking up to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like, you know, it's architects like yourself who are kind of like pushing the boundaries and challenging people, you know, because your practice as well is also very philosophical, the way you approach things. You think, you know, you rationalize something. It's not, you know, and I know a lot of designers, you know, a lot of architects are like that in a way. They kind of have a thing, but I think with your way of doing things, I mean, like as well, we spoke as well about how you bring technology into, you know, sort of 3D printing, all these other different elements to kind of to challenge the way we approach the built environment and our homes and our spaces and things. I mean, you recently shared Jane Bennius's principles from the Biomimicry and Innovation Inspired by Nature book. And you, I mean, I'm not going to read all of it, but it says nature runs on sunlight. Nature uses only the energy it needs. Nature fits form to function. Nature recycles everything. Nature rewards competition. And you put in this post, which I saw obviously is where this all come from when we started chatting. But you said if you swap the word nature with building, or you swap the word nature with community, so you know, nature runs on sunlight. Well, building runs on sunlight. Community runs on sunlight. You know, nature fits form. You know, recycles everything. You know, the building recycles. Community. I mean, what a challenge! I mean, I found that it's that's what really sparked. Actually, yes, what a fantastic set of principles to kind of like design anything about. I mean, obviously it's all about regeneration as well, you know, and obviously equity and things, but I mean, can you sort of explain a little bit more about sort of for you why regeneration is important?
Yes, well, regeneration is, well, I mean, having been involved in this sustainability thing for some years, prior to the crash, when everything was heading in the right way, I do recall a conference once, and I think it was Michael Braungout from Cradle to Cradle, who was sort of having a rant about words and their meanings, and he really didn't like the word sustainability. And his story was, for example, he said, suppose you were, let's say you had a best friend and he got married and you were his best man, and then you don't see him for 10 years, and then you bump into him 10 years later, and you say, well, how's everything? And he said, well, how's the marriage? And the reply is sustainable. would sort of think, oh, I'm sorry to hear that. So it's sort of the word itself is something that thinks that if we try really hard, we could just manage to just sort of try and keep the thing ticking over. And that's not what life is about. You go into forest and see an ecosystem, you know, flourishing. It's abundant. It's, you know, and it's dynamic, and it's, you know, there's so many words that could use. You know, you need a poet to come and do this. But that's the thing, is we need a better word. And at the time, I think at the conference, which was in America, I think the Americans stood up and said, yeah, we recognize that, and we think we've got the word. And the word is, they were coming up with was betterment. And we're going like, okay, I'm not sure that's going to come across the pond to us. So it's good to see. So regenerative design, I think, is interesting, but it doesn't really cover it. And I'm sure other languages around the world have words that we don't use, and maybe we should start using those or something. But regenerative is about making something more than what was there at the beginning. So when I said earlier that everything's borrowed dust, including us, so, you know, we put our hands in the ground, we make something. We can make a brick out of dirt. So the ground is valueless. We make a brick, it's square. Suddenly someone's going to give you £1 for it. you've got a business going. And then you can dream. So you dream and you get organized and you build, I don't know, an art gallery, a cathedral, a house or something. And it's just amazing to see that. But the dust will return eventually to being dust again. So in that interim period of the borrowed dirt, what is the flourishing that is going to happen? What's the abundant life that's going to happen on all fronts, not just inside a city or human beings, or even for the business person who's commissioned the building, but also for all of life. You know, we need to have that as a paradigm in terms of how we approach how we make the world. And architects, I think, you know, at the forefront of the built environment, which is 40% or more of carbon emissions, have a huge ability to sort of put their head in the clouds and their feet on the ground to think laterally about how to, you know, sort of minimize that. But yeah, so it's about life, I think. Yeah,
that's really lovely. And I mean, you said the flourishing. I mean, you're just using that word so naturally, actually. Yeah. And I mean, you don't think, you said about sustainability. It does have a kind of limiting. It's just like, oh, we're just ticking along. It's like, it's just fine.
It also makes us feel that we're kind of, you know, we're doing okay, sort of thing. Yeah. I mean, the thing I tried to, so we were teaching this, obviously, our summer school, and trying to get the younger people before they go into university to sort of think already in this manner. That's why we went across to Mars, get them to think about, you know, the impossible, because there's nothing there. You can't, how are you going to do it? And never mind that, how are you going to keep 5 people sane for 2 years? You know, and you talked about a photograph in a hospital that helps healing because it's a natural photograph. Well, you have to think like that. And therefore, if we're going to think like that there, why can't we think like that here? So when you design a building, the building, unfortunately, our architectural education makes us think that we're designing this sort of object, or this, to some degree, sometimes it's a monument and it's a static thing. But actually it's not. That's not what we're designing. We're not designing static things, because a static thing is always dead. We're designing a catalyst. That's what we're doing. This is a catalyst in a community to bring together things, a flow of things, a flow of energy, of people, of life, of culture, of whatever. And this is just a different paradigm, way of thinking.
Yeah. I think it's a intelligent way of putting it, as well as a very spiritual. And I mean, I mentioned about your work being poetic, but there is, I think we should have more beauty and more awe in our built environment.
Awe is a good word. Very good.
Yeah. You know, because I think it does create that within us. I mean, we do, you know, that, and respect for the planet, and respect. And I think, and I don't make a secret of it. One of my sort of dreams is really to, if we can persuade as many people as possible to bring biophilia or biophilic design principles, who says wiggling her fingers like with inverted commas in the air. But if we can bring more of that actually into the built environment, and people are surrounded by plants and trees, but natural light and air and sound and haptic, the sort of like the touch, all the sort of tactile nature of things, and the colorways and color schemes, it's just going to it's going to, by default, it's going to embed in their brain somehow that they will have a more inherent all sort of pervasive respect for nature, and therefore with their purchasing choices and lifestyle choices on so many levels, you know.
Yeah.
So
But it's not just having the respect for nature. I think the nature is, because we're part of nature, our lives can't be fully flourishing unless we're connected to it. So during the lockdown, the first well, last year really,
yeah,
you know, it dawned on us that, you know, for those of us that we do live in a sort of a rural area, and the one thing that we could do is we could go out for walks.
yeah,
And just be part of nature. And then you see on TV, you know, sort of a family of 6 living in a 2-bedroom apartment, sort of 8 stories up, no parks or anything near them. So there's you know, there's different types of poverty, and there's a thing called spatial poverty, or even nature poverty. And all of those things, space and nature, you know, are also needed, as well as bread and warmth and clothes and security, all those sorts of things. So, you know, we really need to bear that in mind, because, you know, how can anyone flourish if they may have all the money in the world, but if you're locked up in a tower like that, you're not going to flourish.
no, exactly. It's criminal, I think, actually.
Yeah.
I think we should have parks everywhere. I think there should be more greenery so people can get out and breathe as well.
Yeah,
You know, there's the health element too, isn't there? So and maybe we could talk a little bit about a couple of your projects, you know, so that listeners and watchers can, you know, can get an idea of things that you've done. And again, people who are listening, I'm going to put on the journal biophilicdesign.com some links and some images to your work. So I encourage people to subscribe as well. So I always forget to ask people to do that. So there's my little plug. I mean, maybe we could start with schools. I mean, education side of things. As I said, I know what we spoke about letting a lot of light in, and obviously education and study, having a lot of natural light. They've proven that, you know, people study better and they focus better, and, you know, they absorb information better as well. I mean, can you explain, you know, is it obviously it's a conscious decision, obviously you've expressed that, to bring in a lot of natural light, but what other features do you aim to bring in, particularly in education maybe, or anywhere else?
Well, yes, I mean, we had been involved in some education projects, including master planning for some schools.
Yeah.
And when we first entered the sort of project, or got introduced to the school to help them with something, it was usually around something quite small, like maybe a little extension here, or something quite modest. And you know, unfortunately, they would ask our opinion. What do you think? Do you think we should do this? And we would say, well, I think there's a lot more other things you need to sort of get your head around first before you think about doing something like that, tweaking at the edges. So we would encourage them to sort of do a master plan, a strategic master plan about how they use their space. So there's a long-term sort of program there for 15 or 20 years about how the school's being used. And in fact, one local school that we worked on, they needed more space. But then when we brought our team on board, you know, and including a curriculum analyst, who came in and actually said, you don't need any more space. You just need to rejig your curriculum properly. So, you know, actually doing yourself without a building, you know, which is doing without a project for us, but that's the way you have to do it. But all the different things that, when you are master planning the things, what are the key things that make for good academic performance and help young people grow? And so we did some digging around and some research and what those things might be, because we know that there are things like light, views, you know, all these sorts of things, which are, or plants or whatever, greenery, and they are essential, absolutely essential. They're foundational. But actually, when you look at the analysis of what affects academic performance most, one of the things that struck me was actually it was the distance between classes. When you change from one class to the other, the amount of time it takes you to get to the next class. Within a certain distance, beyond that, there's a chance for disruption.
Yeah.
Shall we say, a little bit of pushing and shoving as you go.
Yeah.
And that can be unsettling for the next class, for the person too. So, you know, those are sorts of things that are also have to be included. So I know you're talking about classrooms, but it doesn't matter what environment we're in, where we're spending a lot of time there, particularly offices or something like that, where we're trying to do a job of work and concentrate quite heavily. Some time ago in the early 2000s, we had a software program that we were developing for sustainability for architecture, and we were talking to Vivian Loftnest, who was professor at Carnegie Mellon, and she had an amazing tool which was for officers, which she was wondering what to do with. And they'd done all this data analysis and had all these peer-reviewed papers from around the world about the effects of, say, daylight, fresh air, views, plants inside an office space. And they aggregated them all into a tool that allowed a developer just to sort of see what's his return on investment. If he spends a little bit of money on this, what's he gonna get in return? And one of the striking things was, because it was a whole life analysis of an office building, so over 25 years, the total cost of the whole building, and that includes the construction, but also she included the salaries, the overhead, so the total overhead. And so the building cost, I think, was something over 25 years, was something like 4%. Was nothing. Yeah. Absenteeism, and bear in mind this was the US. Absenteeism, I think, was something like I can't remember. It was like 12 or 14%. Mm. So with her metrics that she had for how each of these things could make a healthy environment and reduce absenteeism, when it was all aggregated, if you put them all in the pot, which was probably going to cost another, I don't know, 0.1% to the building, so 4.1%. But it actually reduced absenteeism down to about 7%.
That's crazy.
So the value there is phenomenal,
it is.
Just by these small tweaks. And that's the kind of thing that we need to have, those kind of tools to help us design schools and offices and homes and things.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, it helps get things over the line, doesn't it? It helps educate people. I mean, unless you know, and not rather do that, you understand it, you've seen it, you've witnessed it, you kind of know. But actually having things like that where you can use it as a really accessible tool that you can, demonstrate to people, the people who've got the purse strings, really, or the people who are commissioning people.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So it's the purse strings. So the reason for this tool is to show value in terms of, if you're going, the person who's paying for it, you need to talk them money. And you have to show how you're going to save money. And of course you will save money if you start working in the grain of nature. It's just inevitable.
That's lovely. I love that. I love that phrase. See, I told you you're a poet. So you have these phrases like, so we spoke about that, and you have worked on the Eden project as well, didn't you? I mean, that was a while ago, and it is a beautiful space. Could you tell us a little bit about how, that project?
It was an interesting project. I worked for a different company, Grimshaw Architects at the time, and we were quite tickled when Tim Schmidt walked off the street into us and said, you're the people to build my project, and I need the 8th wonder of the world. And, but I've only got like £5,000. So how do you do that? And of course we rushed ahead to sort of design what we thought was adequate, but it was quite a difficult project because he didn't own the land. Yeah. And we designed this lovely building, but actually, even though we'd agreed where there would be mining or not mining, because it was a clay mine, you'd go down there sort of four weeks later, having designed your building, and realize your building is like 20 meters in the air. They didn't stick to where they said they would mine, and the ground's moving all the time. So normally the thing an architect can rely on is if the ground's going to stay still until you instruct someone to move the ground. But in this case, the ground was moving all the time, and it was impossible to design a building really in that sort of, because unless the building was designed and priced, they wouldn't get the funding. Mm-hmm. It was all back to front. Yeah. So the solution was really looking again at nature, biomimicry, at things like how would nature do this? How do you make minimal surfaces so that it's cheap, so you can build it for as £5,000? How do you get all these huge components up a small lane in Cornwall? How do you do these things? How do you maximize the sunlight so that you can reduce the amount of energy that's needed to heat the space? So nature does it in a wonderful way. Bubbles, is a very minimal surface, and the thing with the bubble is you can subdivide it very easily into a grid of standard small components, which are easily transportable.
Oh, okay.
So the idea was then if you build your building out of bubbles and put them all together, and then you push the bubbles into the ground, that's it. You've designed the building. Now, if the ground changes up or down, all it's doing is moving across the sphere of the bubble, and so you'll just add a few more components or reduce the components. But it means you can carry on designing the whole thing. So it's almost an evolutionary process of design, where the design finds itself. It emerges just by respecting the constraints and working with the constraints. And I think that's how nature works. How does nature do something so amazingly beautiful and extremely parsimonious because it's always efficient? Well, if we could copy that, which is what the biomimeticists are wanting to do, then we're heading in the right direction. But the thing with biomimicry, though, is whilst it's interesting talking about form and structure and materials and different types of fabric and all that sort of stuff, the thing that fascinates me more is the algorithm, which is process. Okay. How does that evolutionary process work? And how does it become so finely tuned when you have things? And how do these things live in such a community, you know, an ecosystem? Because that's how they all work. They flourish. If you look at, you know, trees or funguses, all those sorts of things, how they're part of this dynamic web of life. How does that emerge? And it's an evolutionary process. So I believe, you know, that's our kind of architectural approach, is not to be prescriptive from the beginning, and just try and not run away from the problems. So usually with a project, you'd have assets and you have liabilities across the table that you have to contend with. What we try and do is we try and move the liabilities across to become assets, and they kind of form the building, and you get a much richer building than you could have dreamt up if we put a beret on our head and had a 2B pencil and sort of sketched up something. So we kind of try and let it happen, and you're trying to listen to all the stakeholders. It's not just about the clients, it's about the local community, it's about the local environment, it's about you know, ecology, it's about all these things. If you're in a city, the ecology might be, you know, it needs to have a symbolism, it has to have meaning. Yeah. All these things, you put them in the pot, and the building will find its place. Yeah. But then you have to know technically how you're going to actually build that.
Yeah. So yeah, you need to have the expertise as well. So. On your website, you have these things called para houses.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you sort of explain the idea and concept behind those, please?
Yes. Well, para means paragraph. So in the planning policy documents, there's a paragraph there, which is a small, a few words paragraph, but incredibly powerful. And it's been around since John Gummer. So Lord Debenham, I think his name is now. He started about 25, 30 years ago, maybe, and it was something called it had various names, and it's had various iterations. So the last iterations have been, it was paragraph 55, then it was paragraph 79, and now it's paragraph 80. And this paragraph is more or less the same as what it's been over the last 20 years. And he thought that we need to encourage people and patrons to build houses in the countryside that become cultural assets for future generations in our country, that define and express who we are and how we live. And we all enjoy going to the National Trust and seeing these amazing buildings, generally historic buildings. And most people obviously don't like the modern buildings, but that is our age. And so he wanted this clause in the policy documents to be able to encourage people to do that. And it's been quite successful. And originally the intention was that the measure of it's very difficult because it's quite subjective. And the measure is that it has to be exceptional architecture. Okay. And innovative, and now it's changed to or innovative. Now innovative has been moved out, but it has to be exceptional so that it has a chance to become one of these cultural assets in the future. And of course, the problem is who's the arbiter of that at this time. And as we know, most architectural styles, when we had architectural styles changing over millennia, have always been not welcome. Yeah. You know, there's always been a reaction because it's new. It's the new. Yeah. But you know. 50 years later, you know, we all like the 50s architecture now, you know, and the 60s architecture is all coming back, you see. So it's a tricky thing because you do have to push forward and you have to pioneer a bit, but at the same time, you know that you're probably going to be contentious. Mm-hmm. And it's difficult. What you want to do is get everyone on board with you, as I said before, all the people in the community. Mm. And so generally we try and do that. And generally we're quite successful at that. But we do have occasion where it doesn't matter what you do, no one's going to see it. And someone said, I think recently, some will see when shown, and some will never see. And unfortunately, some that will never see are the ones that will make sure you don't get planning permission.
Yeah, I often find they have the loudest voices as well for some reason. Yeah. Or the ones that I listen to. Maybe that's something more to do with our media dissemination than anything else, really. Okay. I mean, maybe you could describe a little bit about, you know, one of the, or you know, some of the houses that you have designed. You know, kind of give people a bit of a feel.
Yeah. So generally, we have a grain of how we approach these things, because with these houses, they're all in the countryside. They have to be isolated. That's one of the criteria. It must be isolated. Yeah. So they are going to sit in English countryside.
Yeah.
And people do want to see exceptional architecture. They do want to see beautiful things, even if at the time they think it's too modern, but maybe later it'll still be beautiful. So when we walk around the English countryside now and we see these beautiful clay tile roofs of historic buildings set in the countryside, it's a very Arcadian sort of view, but we enjoy that. But what we don't want to see is everyone's trampoline, barbecue, cars, all that kind of stuff. So we develop around a courtyard principle. So we use courtyards, particularly courtyards sunken into, and houses sunken into the ground, so they work with the landscape. So you can't quite tell where the boundary between landscape, nature, and ecology and house is. It's just a continuum from outside to deep inside, and that sort of blends with the natural form of the land and nature. But by making courtyards, particularly if you suppress them into the ground, if you're living in the house, you can enjoy the house still to whatever you want to do, have your trampoline or whatever. But from the outside, no one's going to see that. So it's about understanding the impacts on the wider aspect of the setting. So they're all based around that. And as I said before, we try and, if we're following an evolutionary process to how design is, the design is finding its own shape, depending on the land, also obviously the client's requirements, depending on planning, and it kind of forms itself. So a lot of the buildings are quite organic. But the problem is, how do you build an organic building which is very unstandard in an economic way? And at the same time, we have to put innovation into these buildings to show how we can use this as a sort of a test bed to try different things that can be replicated into more mass-produced houses. So the thing for us is how do you decarbon the whole process, not just the operation of a building. So when people say, oh, it's a zero carbon building, what they mean is it's zero carbon in operation. But we should ask the question, what about zero carbon in construction? Yeah. And so, when you take a traditional brick, we talked about putting our hands in the ground and making a shape. Well, that's fine. And we've been doing that for 7,000 years. But, only the last few thousand years have we made them hard bricks by burning them. Yeah. Now we burn them with gas. And of course, we worry about using the gas and the cost of the gas. But, our thing is, well, why can't we not use gas? Why can't we just use raw earth? Because they're still using that around most of the world, and it's perfectly fine. So with our houses, we try and bring in that kind of thing where we're using raw earth all the time. And a recent house here and in the Chilterns was using just the chalk from the ground, and we compress that, and we can make beautiful things inside and outside, just using natural, one could say almost primitive materials. But when you combine that with high technology and various other things, you get this amalgam of things which hopefully can point the way. I mean, none of the houses ever achieve 100% of what we're trying to do, but if we can test a few things and achieve a few things, so that when we are building sort of more volume housing or something like that, we can actually show people. Because when you talk about something like this, no one ever wants to do it because they're not convinced. But if you show people, and then you can also show the economic figures as well, everyone goes, oh, well, that's a good idea. That's what we're aiming to do. Yeah,
and I suppose as well, using local materials from the earth, then it's more sustainable anyway, isn't it? You don't have to travel, bring that stuff so far.
Yeah, I mean, local materials, but when we talk about the original definition of sustainability from Rio, was the triple bottom line, the sort of economic, social, and ecological balance. And now we want to put justice in there and equity. But if you're looking at those things, we talked about the biomimicry, how nature runs on things, but the other thing that we plug into the brief that we get from clients is that triple bottom line. So when you do something, whether it's thinking about how you're going to construct a wall, or how you're going to do X, Y, and Z, or how you're going to form something, you ask the questions, those three questions. How can it improve the ecology? How can it improve things socially, locally, and economically? And so we're always going to try and tap into local manufacturers, so we can help increase their business and employment. But at the same time, on a societal level, how do we bring in the local crafts? So that there's a local expression. So whether we're doing something in the Chilterns here, or if we did something in Iceland, it would be different. but it would be using the same DNA, shall we say.
Yeah. And back to the sort of power idea, isn't it? Like you're saying, you know, something that people will want to go back to because it is a thing of their time. And like you say, we go to a Regency house, we go to a stately home, and you know, often that's made from local stone, Cotswold stone, or whatever it is. You know, so there is those elements as well.
Our latest innovation that we're doing now is we were raiding the brick, the local brick guy, because we were up there looking at his bricks, which are beautiful bricks, and he's one of 2 people in the world who actually fires his bricks with wood.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
One could argue maybe carbon neutral, but the jury's out. But it's better than gas. But you know, asking this question about why fire it in the first place. So he's also developing, you know, helps us develop these raw earth bricks. But actually, we did notice there was an awful lot of waste in his yard because some things misfire, the specification's not quite correct, or the client doesn't want it anymore, and he tries to shift these, you know, over the years. Of course, when they don't shift, he moves them around the yard, and eventually they get moved out and they get crushed for aggregate. So you get it's recycled downward. And we asked the question, well, what about, can't we just take all of that rubbish, his term, and can't we just build a house out of that? Of course, if you said that to anyone, they say, well, it's going to look awful. But not if you get a local craftsman. You get the local craftsman who builds the local flint walls, and we say, right, here's you know, a pallet of tiles, a pallet of broken bricks, blue bricks, red bricks, metric bricks, imperial bricks, Roman bricks, all different colors. Make a piece of art, and you build the whole building out of that. And then in that you can also put things like bird boxes, bat boxes, places for bees, you know, all those sorts of things, and it becomes a thing of beauty. And the inspiration came from kintsugi, you know, the kintsugi Japanese art of repairing a broken ceramic piece with gold, so it's more valuable than the original piece. Well, by the time this craftsman's finished with this wall is so beautiful, you know, and he's just taken the local rubbish, so we'll call it kintsugi wall.
I love that idea. Yeah, and saying it's like with, you know, putting bat boxes and bird things, it becomes a piece of beauty, isn't it? Really, yeah.
It's so the building. When we talk about the building being a catalyst in the community, it's not just for humans. How do we get life to? It's not just about a green roof anymore, or a garden. Let's make the whole building a habitat for humans and the rest of nature. Obviously, technically, you're designing it so that you're not going to have, you know, crazy things eating your house.
Yeah, exactly, like your neighbors. Keep them out. Yeah, exactly. But it's what's lovely as well, you know, the concept of what you're doing with the sort of powerhouses is also, it's aspirational, isn't it? You're saying you're showing people, so people go, I love that, I want that, how can I do that? And so it's just, hopefully this whole concept and everything will snowball and inspire other people. You mentioned, you talk about this central courtyard and you build around a courtyard. I did an interview, and I've another one to post up yet, but it was Dr. Patty Baker, and she specializes in ancient gardens, walled gardens, so like Pompeii, Herculaneum, and that sort of things. We've had a discussion about how they obviously did wall paintings, but they had all the plants in there and the sort of inside outside type thing. And I've always wanted, I've got like a design that I've kind of like done on a back of an envelope, as it were, like the design of my house always had this like Roman courtyard thing in the middle, but I think it's such a lovely idea, because also it's protecting that central area, it's private, and it's obviously stop the wind blowing as well if you're, you know, if you're in a certain areas. It's not
the rest of the world has always developed courtyard houses. For some reason we haven't in the UK, and it's something we really need to bring and express it in a unique UK way. But it's a great thing, particularly if you start building more dense communities, you know, in villages and things.
Yeah, exactly. I love it. So again, people listening, I'm going to put some links on the journal of biophilicdesign.com. So I encourage people to go on and find this podcast with David Kirkland. And David, if you can send some photographs as well like that, and then we'll feature those too. But is there anything else that you'd like to add in particular before I ask you the final question? Is there anything that you're burning to cover?
No, it's fine. I think it's been a great conversation. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to get you back. So, and we're going to talk about all other things as well. You know, sort of, you know, different projects that you're running, and sort of, you know, some of the design work that you're doing, and sort of challenges with the, you know, the sort of the younger generation that's coming up, and stuff, and how you stimulate that, and sort of encourage the sort of the biophilic side. But the final question that regular listeners of the podcast know, if you could brush the world with this magic brush of biophilia, what would it look like?
Yes, I saw that, and I was having to think about that. And actually, I mean, it might not be the answer you want, but the way I see it, it's already painted, it's already brushed. It's just that no one sees it, and we've got to be able to see. And that's the thing, is I think, come and see, and that's what we're trying to do in our buildings, just come and see. And whilst it may not be happening in certain places, it's all around us, and we just need to open our eyes into that. And so the word you used previously was awe. I think we need to recover that sense of awe. And I don't think you can recover it unless you are looking at nature, unless you are able to see the stars or be in a forest or see plants. You're devoid of that. We need to find a way of encouraging that in our culture, in our community. But at the same time, we're also mindful that there are some parts of the natural world we don't want. So we don't want COVID. We don't want the viruses. So, we're still the arbiters of what comes in and what goes out. But we should be letting in more than we're letting in at the moment. But let's just open our eyes.
Thank you for listening to the Journal of Biophilic Design podcast.